so that you can always go back and listen to these lectures, the class recordings. So uh, please feel free to download the lectures, the recordings, the class recordings from the respective channels. As you have seen, we have created different channels for different topics, and feel free to download any of these lectures from the respective channels. But it will be completely your responsibility to download these classes. We are not going to send these class recordings. It will be saved in the Microsoft Teams for several weeks before it gets expired. So once it gets expired, there will be no backup for these recordings. So if you are interested in downloading the recordings, go ahead and download them as soon as we finish the class. Okay, now before we I get into the particular topic, I always discuss, because this is the first class of this course. I always would like to discuss that why living system, because where right now it's I think 2 semester I'm teaching online, but before that, whenever I used to teach this particular course to the students like you, like engineers, so always students used to ask that why we are supposed to learn about biological systems, why we need to learn about living system. Okay, and there is no problem asking such type of questions that are quite relevant. You are definitely engineers. You are meant to learn different concepts of engineering. That's perfectly fine. But when it comes to the study of living system, what's the purpose, right? Now, I now before I get into any of the slides, we can say I would like to mention that we it's not only us, the entire academic sector across the world now is about compelled to take classes online because of one particular biological phenomena that is impacting all across the world, right? And that is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been caused by one particular virus, right? And during this particular season, everybody is become so much concerned about their safety, about the hygienity, and a lot of people and there is a lot of people, lot of community are taking wrong steps, and that is because of the improper information or maybe ignorance about these biological entities that is causing this particular pandemic, right? So during this particular era of COVID-19 pandemic, we have learned about a lot of different things that needs to be done in order to maintain proper sterility. Right? For example, we have been asked to wash our hands on a regular basis with hand sanitizers. Okay, now what are the hand sanitizers? These are basically alcohols. Why you are rubbing your hands so frequently with hand sanitizers, right? Because the viruses are basically, if you get the viruses on your hands, and if you rub your hands with the alcohols, these alcohols can compromise the integrity of the membrane of these viruses. What is the membrane? These are basically lipid molecules which covers the virus particles. Okay, so if you apply alcohol on them, that basically compromises the integrity of the virus particles, and that's why the entire virus particle dissociates, disassembles, and that makes them inactive, right? Simple, very simple phenomena, very simple concept. Okay, but this particular concept is not known to regular people, normal people. And this is the I think the most simplest phenomena, starting from the hand sanitizer to developing new diagnostic systems. We are facing a lot of problems with the test. Then we are talking about vaccines. Different companies are coming up with different kinds of vaccines. Some are basically mRNA based vaccines. When you are, I think most of you, if you are just following news, you have heard about mRNA based vaccines, DNA based vaccines, their storage conditions, blah blah, right? So you are hearing a lot of these kind of things, and if you see, the entire world economy is kind of revolving across this particular pandemic. New companies, new businesses are coming up in order to uh, generate new kind of solutions uh, across the pandemics. For example, nowadays you hear a lot about paints which are having antiviral activities, right? Coatings which are having antiviral activities. You are hearing about models, like computer scientists are preparing models by which we can predict that by what time this particular pandemic will end, whether it is going to be more severe in the coming days, blah blah, right? So the entire world economy is evolving across this particular pandemic. And what is the pandemic? Just a biological phenomena. It is it is caused by a virus which is that in terms of dimension, that is nanometer range, right? So tiny particles which is causing such a huge impact upon the world health, world economy, each and every sector in the world. So that's why it's important, definitely, it's important to have some basic ideas about these living systems, because these are some of the finest, most complicated systems from where we can learn a lot. Okay, and we can actually implement these phenomena in our daily life. Not only daily life, in our profession, whatever profession we are in, we should be able to implement a lot out of these if we learn about these concepts. Okay, so at the very beginning of this particular lecture, I love to show two particular examples where which is based upon this particular phenomena, that nature is an engineer's best inspiration. What is that? Okay, so I think all of you have heard about the bullet train, and this particular train is also known as Shinkansen train, because the Shinkansen is the rail company which has designed this particular train. Now, initially, in the initial phase, when this train was designed and developed, the train used to have doesn't used to have such a sharp nose. It used to have just a blunt end head. Okay, and because of its high speed, whenever it used to enter into a tunnel, it used to create huge amount of air pressure inside the tunnel, and whenever it used to emerge from the tunnel, it used to come out of the tunnel, that huge air pressure that has been built used to get released, and as a result of that, it used to cause a shotgun like a huge shotgun like noise which could be heard miles apart. And that's why whenever this particular train, like whenever people used to take this, like the passengers inside the train used to have huge headache during their journey because of these kind of noise pollution. Okay, and that's why at the initial phase, the train company was suffering to run the train at its best possible speed, highest possible speed. Okay, so Eiji Nakatsu was a mechanical engineer who used to work in this particular company, and he is one of the principal designer or advisor of who is behind the designing of this train. And in his leisure time, he used to watch birds. Okay, so one day he was watching the kingfisher who is diving in the water in search of a meal, and what he noticed, that while he this particular bird was diving in the water, it barely creates any ripples or waves in the water. Okay, and this particular design is a design by the nature, so that the kingfisher, while diving in the water, creates minimum agitation in the water, so that it can very easily get the fish in the water. Because if there is a huge agitation, it will lose its bite. It will lose its food, meal, right? Lose the fish, right? So based upon that, AG what decided, he introduced these kind of design in the train. And once this design has been improvised, the entire problem of the noise solution was completely gone away, completely solved. Not only that, now with the improvised design, with the improved design, the train can even achieve higher speed. So this is one of the unique and finest example of bio-inspired design. Okay, where the design of a bird's nose has been implemented into a train in order to solve its problems, in order to solve a hardcore mechanical problem, right? Another example is basically the Velcro. So another mechanical engineer, he went for a hike in the woods, and when he came back, he find that these kind of seeds, which are cocklebird seeds, which was sticking to his socks. And what he did is he took these particular seeds and look under the microscope, and what he find that these seeds have very unique hook kind of structures. So based upon that, what he did is he designed this Velcro where you have a hard hook kind of structure in one part, and the other one is having the fabrics, and that actually developed the Velcro. So Velcro is nothing but a combination of velour and crochet. Okay, that is fiber along with the crochet. Okay, so another very unique and finest examples of the bio-inspired designs. And this is not the end. Okay, there are thousands such examples of bio-inspired designing. Okay, so another very important research which is going on in the storage industry, in the digital industry, is basically whether we can use DNA, the which is the basic genetic material for any living organism. So whether we can utilize DNA as our storage materials. Now, why is certainly DNA? Because DNA is the genetic material that all of the living organism contains, and all the information, the genetic information which is required in order to develop our organism, in order to for the organism to live their daily life, everything is stored inside the DNA. So it's huge amount of information which is stored inside the DNA. And not only that, DNA is one of the most stable material on the earth. For example, I think all of you have seen the particular movie or the series of movies called Jurassic Park, right? And there scientists have regenerated the dinosaur period by identifying DNAs of the dinosaurs after thousands and thousands of years. So they have isolated the DNAs and then uh, get all the informations about the dinosaur era from the DNA of the dinosaurs, and subsequently have regenerated the dinosaurs. Now, regenerating the dinosaurs is the sci-fi part. That's the imaginary part. But whatever we know so far about those ancient times is everything based upon the information that we have gained from the DNAs that was there, that was stable for thousands of years. So we have retrieved DNAs and then we have retrieved information about our ancient times. That means in terms of the stability, this particular molecule is extremely stable, and this molecule is extremely robust in terms of storing data. So in this particular Nature paper, scientists have compared that DNA as with the other storage platforms. So if you see the hard disk, the read and write speed of the hard disk is about 3000 to 5000 bits per second. Whereas in terms of the DNA, that's less than 100. Okay, so 100 bits per second. In terms of the flash memory, it's about 100, but in terms of the DNA, it's less than 100. Data retention. One particular hard disk or the flash memory can store your data stably for more than 10 years. DNA can store it for more than 100 years. Okay, and again, power density, data density, or power of the usage, everything in terms of all these aspects, DNA is way better than the conventional storage devices. And in this particular article, they have performed a simulation in order to calculate that how much of the DNA would be needed in order to store the entire world's data. And it came out as a 1 kg. That means just 1 kg of DNA would be sufficient to store the entire world's data. You can imagine how compact the data could be. Okay. So, and this is not just one particular paper. The Microsoft Corporation has launched a huge project in order to utilize DNA as a storage device. Okay, and this is from 2016. This particular program is going on from 2016, and they actually has developed a laboratory prototype in collaboration with the University of Washington. They have developed a laboratory prototype where they have shown that it's possible to convert the digital data, which is a binary data, to convert in the language of the DNA, which should be a quaternary platform for storing all these data. So they already have developed a laboratory prototype for that. Okay. If you are interested, you are always welcome to Google about it. You should be able to get the latest information about it. And it's not only the Microsofts, it's not only one particular organism, it's each and every premier research institutions are investing huge amount of funds, merits, efforts, times in order to develop interdisciplinary research so that we can utilize, we can do better in the biological sector. So these are some of the key areas where IIT KGP is pioneering in terms of, for example, in terms of developing point of care diagnostic systems, in terms of developing self-sanitizing surfaces which can reduce the overall burden of the transmission. Uh, uh, Scientists from computer science department, electronics, along with the bioscience and SMST departments have developed biosignal biomarker based analysis of disease progressions, advanced bioimaging, drug discovery through artificial intelligence and machine learnings, and the disease model based management of epidemics and pandemics. So these key areas, if you are interested, you please go to the institute website. You should be able to find a good amount of information in each of these areas. And each of these areas, basically different departments, for example, the School of Bioscience in association with the Mechanical Engineering department has developed this particular technology, which has been recognized by different sectors, the COVIRAP technology. Okay, so different schools, the biological science schools, the medical science schools are working with different departments, different engineering departments in order to develop new projects, new technologies for the betterment of for the advancement of the healthcare sectors. Okay, so the bottom line is that the biological science or the life science is not only restricted to the biologists. Different like the professionals, scientists, researchers from different disciplines are participating in this particular discipline in order to develop new technologies. Now, before getting into the living system, before getting into our topic, I'd like to mention that what are the specific characteristics of the living system, how to distinguish between living and dead. So if it is a living system, no matter how simple it is. If you think about the simplest form of life, you should consider the bacteria. It's a single unicellular organism, which is the simplest form of life. But even that simplest form of life should have high degree of complexity. Okay, mechanism of sensing and responding to the alteration of the surroundings. If it is a living system, it should be able to sense and response to the alteration in the environment. For example, if you are a living organism, you should be able to sense the temperature across you. If it is cold, you should be able to sense it. If it is hot, you should be able to sense it. Very simple form of sensing. Okay. So if it is a living system, it should have the ability to sense and respond to the alteration of the surroundings. For example, you take a plant from your garden and put it inside your home just by the side of your window. It will always try to go out of the window so that it can have some light. That means it's sensing the scarcity of the light and try to modulate itself so that it can get more light. So that's its way of sensing and responding to the alteration to its environment. System for extracting, transforming, and using energy from the environment. Whenever you take food, that's your way of extracting energy from the environment, and subsequently your metabolic system convert that particular food into a simplest form of molecules, which could subsequently be converted into the form of energy. Okay, for example, if you take food, that could be converted into glucose, and that glucose could be metabolized subsequently in order to generate ATP, and that ATP is necessary for you to perform different functions in your daily life. Okay, ability to adapt and evolve. For example, during my postdoctoral research, I lived in central part of the USA, a bit northern side, where we used to have minus 20 degrees centigrade during the winter. So initially I faced trouble adapting that particular temperature. But subsequently I got adapted to that particular temperature. But again, now that I am back to Kharagpur in this particular hot and humid temperature, initially again I faced trouble and then got adapted. But then people who are living in that particular temperature, generation after generation, they not only adapt to that particular temperature, subsequently these small adaptation lead to long-term evolution of the organisms. So that's why all of the living organisms should adapt and evolve as per the environment. Ability to grow, I don't think I have to explain that, and self-replicate and self-assemble. Any particular living organism, whether it's a unicellular living organism, whether it's a multicellular living organism, it should be able to replicate. If it is a unicellular organism, for example bacteria, so one bacterial cell need to divide into two bacterial cell. That its way to grow and divide. Similarly, for humans, they need to generate their progeny. Any animal, they will generate their progeny. So this self-replication and reproduction is a part of the living organism. Okay, is a is a characteristics of the living organisms. Okay, there are some basic molecules which constitutes different biological molecules, and these are the basic molecules, basic elements which constitutes the different living, not living, but basic biological molecules, and these basic biological molecule creates the living organism. What are they? So hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And as we'll be discussing about different molecules of life, we'll see that all of these molecules are constituted of these different uh, elements. Okay. So as I was saying that these different elements constitute different biological molecules, and different biological molecules creates organisms, living organisms. So these initial elements can together forms larger macromolecules. Okay, there are multiple different macromolecules which constitutes the basic platform for life. And what are those macromolecules? The most important ones are basically nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Okay, so these are the four different kinds of biological macromolecules which creates the platform for the living organisms. Okay, and in today's lecture and next lecture, we are, I think, in these three subsequent lectures, we are going to talk about nucleic acids. Okay, which are the main medium for storing and transferring genetic information. So before I get into the nucleic acid, um, I would encourage, if you guys have any questions, any students, if they have any questions, feel free to stop me and ask. I always encourage my students to ask questions because I love to have an interactive teaching. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And yes,
So could you please explain self-assembly?
definitely. So self-assembly, when we need to self-replicate, when we are talking about self-replication or reproduction, right? So one particular, if you think about the simplest form of life, which is basically the bacteria. Now, one bacteria divides into two bacterial cells, right? But in order to divide into two bacterial cells, first what needs to be done is it needs to replicate its DNA, right? Now, during DNA replication, what happens? Individual nucleotides assemble with each other so that it can form long chain polymers of nucleic acids. So that's why these macromolecules, as I was saying, that these macromolecules constitute the basic platform of life. And there we'll see, as we'll go through the course, you'll see that these are nothing but self-assembly. When you talk about the nucleic acids, they are basically self-assembly of nucleotides. When you talk about proteins, they are basically large assemblies of individual amino acids. Okay, so these large assemblies together constitutes the overall organism. Okay, so in order to self-replicate, you need to generate new living cells, new living organisms, and in order to generate new cells, you need to assemble all different macromolecules like nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Great. Thanks for asking the question. If anybody else wants to ask, definitely feel free to ask, and you can always email me at my email ID. It's you should be able to find my email ID in my website in the School of Bioscience. My name is Arindam Mondol again. So feel free to send me your questions, and once I have the questions, I rather than replying to the individual students, I would like to discuss them during my class. Okay, so that I can discuss the same thing with all of the students who are attending the class. Okay, this is so far going
Sir,
great.
sir, I have a
Yes,
question.
sure,
Sir,
go ahead.
as you said that DNA can be used as a storing material, but how DNA can store? How actually it stores? In computer system, we know that data is stored in binary format, but in DNA, how this process happens?
Yes, this is a very good question. So in the digital system, you have the binary format. That means 0 and 1. So any information could be stored in a 0 and 1 format within this particular within these two letters, right? Or these two numbers. Similarly, for the DNA, as we are going to discuss about the DNA, it is made up of 4 different nucleotides, which are called A, T, G, and C. So here, instead of using a binary format, you need to use a quaternary format to store the information. So it has been shown actually that whatever data is there in the binary format, that could be converted into the quaternary format. And I'm going to send you an assignment, okay? And there you will see that, and there you can see that the same information from a binary format could be converted to a quaternary format, okay? So, and in order to understand that in a greater detail, you have to understand what is there inside the DNA. So let's see how the DNAs are made up of. What are the molecules there in the DNA? Okay. All right. So we are going to talk about DNA. Not only DNA, rather we are going to talk about nucleic acids. There are 2 different kinds of nucleic acids in our system, in our body, in any living organism. It is either deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA, or just ribonucleic acid or RNA. Now, when you talk about the genetic information or genetic material, you take any different kinds of living organism. You go and take any, whether it's simple, whether it's complicated, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's a eukaryote, whether it's a plant, whether it's an animal, whatever. Okay, all of them utilizes DNA as their genetic as the storage device for their genetic information. Only exceptions is there which contains their genetic information inside the RNA. Okay, so anybody wants to have a guess that which particular organism or entity stores their genetic information in the RNA?
Viruses.
Virus.
Excellent, excellent. Yes. So the particular pandemic that we are having, the coronavirus, right? The SARS coronavirus, it's a RNA virus. They retains all their genetic information in the RNA. If you think about influenza virus, dengue virus, chikungunya virus, right? Human immune deficiency virus, or HIV, all of these viruses retains their genetic information inside the RNA. But it's not that all of the viruses retains their genetic information in the RNA. There are viruses like herpes viruses, which causes chickenpox. Okay, so that actually retains their genetic information in the DNA. So there is a lot of variety amongst the viruses, and we are going to talk about those in our virology lecture.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, isn't chickenpox caused by varicella zoster?
Chickenpox is caused by varicella zoster virus and varicella zoster virus. So herpes, when I talk about herpes viruses, herpes is the family of the virus, and varicella zoster virus falls in the herpes viridae family. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Yes. Okay. Excellent.
Sir?
So yes.
Sir,
Mhm.
sir, you said means it can be used as a storage material. Can RNA be also be used in the same way as a storage material?
That's what we are discussing, right? That theoretically it's definitely possible because there are viruses which stores their genetic information in the RNA. So definitely it's possible to store the genetic information inside the RNA. But nature has chosen DNA over the RNA during the course of evolution. We're going to talk about that, okay? Because of the higher stability of the DNA. Now, why DNA is more stable than RNA? In order to understand that, you have to understand about their chemical architecture, chemistry, okay? So let's look into that. Okay, so what are the DNA and RNA are made up of? Before getting into that, I would like to give you some one of the historical perspective. So until like 1928, okay, we didn't used to knew that it's the DNA which serves as the genetic material. Okay, so it's the first Frank Griffith who performed this particular experiment, and which suggested that it's the DNA which act as a storage device for the genetic information. So let me give you a little bit of background for that. So Frederick Griffiths used to be a doctor, okay, a general physician. At that time, it's mostly the biological science research was used to driven by the doctors itself. Okay, so the era was in the 1920s. Now, how many of you have heard about the famous 1918 Spanish flu pandemic? I think with the current ongoing pandemic, several people have came to learn about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. It was, I think, in the course of history, the most devastating pandemic that happened that was caused by the H1N1 influenza virus. Okay. And overall, there was about 500 million infections with 50 million deaths all across the world. Okay. Now, those 50 million deaths was not solely caused by the virus infections. Most of those deaths were caused by secondary infections post virus infection. So nowadays, if you have a viral fever, you go to a doctor and the doctor will give you what? Antibiotic. But the antibiotics are targeted against viruses. What does antibiotic target? Anyone wants to answer? Bacterial infection, right? Excellent. So antibiotics are meant for bacterial infection. Then why, if you have a viral fever, you go to a doctor, the doctor give you bacterial antibiotics?
Prevent secondary infections.
Yes. So whenever you get an infection with the virus, your immune system becomes weak and you have a greater chance of having secondary infections. And if you have two consecutive viral and bacterial infection, it could lead to lethal infection. Okay. For example, certain influenza viruses, even the coronaviruses also infect your respiratory tract. And if your respiratory tract infection goes to lung, that means there will be lung infection. Now, if your initial lung infection is associated with secondary infection, bacterial infection in your lungs, then it's going to be a fatal pneumonial infection. Okay. And as a result of that, the chances is higher that it will lead to a fatal infection. Okay. So that's why during the 1918 Spanish flu, the 50 million people died, and most of the people died due to secondary bacterial infection caused by Streptococcus pneumonia. It's a particular bacteria which can cause lung infection. Okay, so that's why Griffith was working in order to identify different strains of this particular bacteria which could be utilized as a vaccine. So, for example, if one particular bacteria of one particular strain of the same bacteria, the Streptococcus pneumonia, can cause infection but not lethal infection, mild infection, or maybe can infect but will not cause any disease, then such strain of bacteria will be very useful in order to develop vaccine. Okay, so he was looking for different Streptococcus pneumonia strains to identify potential vaccine strains. So he has identified two different strains. One is the rough strain and the other is the smooth strain. Now the major difference between the rough strain and the smooth strain was, in case of the rough strain, it has very rough architecture at its surface. Okay, and actually our immune system can recognize those rough architecture of the bacterial cell surface to trigger the immune response so that it can kill the bacteria and hence help us to survive the infection. In case of the smooth strain, that rough architecture of the surface is covered by a capsule, a lipid capsule kind of layer, so that it has a very smooth architecture at its surface. And that's why whenever the animal, if you get infected with this kind of smooth strain, it can bypass your immune system. That means your immune system will not be able to recognize those rough architecture which is actually masked by the smooth capsule. and as a result of that, it can bypass the immune response, and hence it can cause fatal infection. So what Griffith did, he infected mice with the rough strain and has shown that the mice can survive the infection. But if you infect, when he infected mice with the smooth strain, the mice died. That means the smooth strain can cause lethal infection. Subsequently, what he did is he took the smooth strain and heated it up, heated at a really high temperature. That leads to the rupturing, the complete disassembly of the bacterial cells so that all the components can come out in the solution. He injected that heat-lysed solution into the animal, and the mice survived the infection. Why? Because once you heat kill the bacteria, the entire bacterial cells got ruptured and hence it lost its infectivity. Okay, but surprisingly, when he mixed this solution with the rough strain and then subsequently injected this mixture to the mice died. That means from his experiment, he inferred that there is something, one particular component which was present in the smooth strain and which retains its integrity even after extensive heat lysis procedure. That means even after rupturing all the cells, still that particular molecule is there. And that particular molecule has the capability to transform the rough strain to the smooth strain so that it can now cause lethal infection. Griffith has named that particular molecule as transforming principle because it can transform the non-virulent strain or non-fatal strain, which is the rough strain, to a fatal strain or the smooth strain. Okay. Now that was in 1928. Several years later, three individual scientists, Avery, MacLeod, and McCarthy, they went ahead and tried to find out or tried to characterize that particular molecule. That what is that molecule which can transform the bacteria from a non-virulent bacteria, that is non-pathogenic bacteria, to a pathogenic bacteria. How it is possible? So they tried to characterize that particular molecule. So what they did, they took this particular heat-lysed bacteria. So they took the rough strain, smooth strain, which was lethal, and then again treated it with heat so that it can rupture all the things, all the bacterial cells, so that all the molecules, the component of the bacteria, can come out in the solution. Subsequently, they distributed it equally into three different tubes and then added three different enzymes in these tubes. In one tube, they have added one enzyme which is called proteinase, and that enzyme can cleave off or destroy all the proteins within the solution. In other tube, they have added RNase, which can destroy all the RNA molecule. And in the third tube, they have destroyed all the DNAs by adding DNAs. Okay. And subsequently, they have added these enzyme treated mixture with the rough strain and tried to see then in which particular set the rough strain could be converted into smooth strain. So when all the proteins got destroyed, still the lysate can transform the rough strain to smooth strain. When you destroy all the RNAs, still it can transform the rough to the smooth strain. But when you destroy all the DNAs, then it is not possible for the lysate to transform the rough strain to the smooth strain. And that actually established that it's the DNA which serves as a transformation principle. That means in the DNA of the smooth strain, it contains all the information which is essential for, constituting the lipid capsule at the top of the surface, so that it can mask, the bacteria can mask, it can mask the architecture which gets recognized by the immune response, and hence it makes it lethal, right? So it's the DNA which contains all the information which determines the characteristics of the bacteria. And later on, with all different kinds of experiments, people have shown that it's not only bacteria for any particular organism, it's the DNA which contains all the information. Okay. It dictates each and every characteristics of one particular living organism. Okay. And that established that DNA actually stores all the genetic information for all the living organisms except viruses. And again, viruses, I think we'll discuss that you cannot directly classify viruses as a living organism. So straightforward, you can say that if it is a living organism, it should contain all its genetic information inside the DNA. Okay. So if anybody has any question, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will go to the next slide.
Sir, how does the genetic material of the S cells enter the R cells to make it virulent in the last step
Yes.
of the third row?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Let me tell you that. Okay, so bacteria actually has a specialized character of uptaking DNA from the environment. Okay, because so see, nowadays we are struggling a lot with the, everybody please mute themselves. Okay, so nowadays we are struggling a lot with the antibiotic resistance bacteria. Okay, so nowadays one of the major problem in the medical science is development of the antibiotic resistance bacteria, right? How these bacteria is getting these antibiotic resistance. So basically these bacteria different bacteria can uptake DNA from the environment, okay, which is not possible for the eukaryotes. But the bacteria have specialized machinery which could be utilized in order to uptake DNA not only from the environment but from other bacteria. So if you think about the eukaryotes, how do you get your genetic material? Only from your parents. So it's only in case of the eukaryotes, the genetic information or genetic material gets transferred from the parents to the progeny. But for bacteria, definitely the genetic information gets transferred from the parent to the progeny or the mother to the daughter. But along with that, it can also transfer genetic information from other bacteria as well as from the environment. We call it horizontal gene transfer. Okay, when there is a transfer of genetic material from parents to progeny, it's called vertical gene transfer. Okay, but in case of the prokaryotes, horizontal gene transfer is also possible, where these prokaryotic organisms can uptake DNA either from the environment or from other organisms. Okay, so and they have the specialized machinery for that. Okay, and this is why we are struggling so much with the antibiotic resistance bacteria, because they can, different bacteria in the environment, if there is a generation of one antibiotic resistance bacteria, it can actually transfer the genetic information to other strains of the bacteria. so that it will keep on propagating. So the antibiotic resistance trait will keep on propagating through horizontal gene transfer. Okay, so moving on to the next slide.
So,
Okay,
excuse me.
yes.
So virus is not a prokaryote, right?
Viruses are not prokaryotes. There are three distinct domains of life: prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and archaea. Okay, so prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and archaea. These three are the three distinct domains of life. But viruses cannot be classified in either one of them. They are completely separate. Okay, that's why it has been proposed that viruses should constitute a separate domain of life. But then again, it is difficult to do that because viruses are kind of non-living outside of the host organism. So you cannot actually classify them as a living organism. Okay, but definitely viruses are not prokaryotes. Viruses cannot be classified into either one of these domains of life.
Okay, so how the antibiotics like are useful for preventing viruses? Like you were talking about the second infection, but how does it directly?
So directly this antibiotic doesn't help actually. Okay, so there are certain antivirals. Okay, for influenza there are Tamiflu. Okay, for example, in the case of the coronaviruses, they are using remdesivir. So these are mostly kind of nucleoside analogs. Once we are going to talk about the DNA replication, I can then explain that what is nucleoside analog means. But these are kind of a broad spectrum antivirals. But there are very few antivirals. Antibiotics are not effective against viruses. No, it's only meant to stop the secondary infections.
Sir,
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sir. Sir, so Griffith's experiment was done in 1928, and then MacLeod did it in 1944. So why was there such a long gap? I mean, he
Like it took them such a long time to design the experiment in order to characterize this transformation principle, right? So although it seems pretty straightforward and easy, but think about that particular era where you know nothing about the molecules of life. You don't know how does the DNA look like, how does the protein look like, how does the RNA look like, whether there is one particular. So people didn't knew anything about these systems, right? So that's why maybe. Anyway, now we are going to talk about a very important uh, concept, okay, and that is called central dogma of molecular biology, or central dogma, you can say central dogma of life, because whenever you look into one particular living organism, it should follow this principle. That is, what is that principle? That genetic information should flow from DNA to RNA and then RNA to protein. Okay. So if it is a living organism, it should contain all its genetic information within the DNA. Okay. And subsequently, this genetic information can be transferred to RNA through a process called transcription. Okay, and subsequently the information can be transferred from RNA to protein through a process called translation. Okay, and for any living organism to replicate, it has to undergo DNA replication so that the information could be transferred from one organism to other. Okay, so this is the basic principle of life, and that's why it's called the central dogma of life. If it is a living organism, whatever be it is, if it is a bacteria, the simplest form of life, if it is a human, the one of the most complicated form of life, everybody should follow this particular principle, that we store our genetic information within the DNA, Then the genetic information gets transferred from DNA to RNA through a process called transcription, and then through the process of translation, the genetic information gets converted from RNA to protein. Okay. Now, why transcription and translation? So, say for example, you have information within the DNA. It is getting transferred to RNA. Both are nucleic acids, right? That's why the information is getting transferred within the same language. You can consider that the information which was inside the DNA is getting transferred into the RNA. But both DNA and RNA are the same media, are made up of the same thing, which is nucleic acid, with a little bit of difference in their chemistry. Okay, but the overall media is the same, which is the nucleic acid. So the information or the data is getting transferred from within the same media, from one molecule to the other. And that's why it's called transcription. But then when it is getting transferred from the RNA to protein, it's getting transferred to a completely different language altogether. So the nucleic acids are made up of 4 different nucleotides, ATGC in case of the DNA. In case of the RNA, it's AUGC. Okay. But in case of the protein, there are 20 different amino acids which together prepares the protein. So that's why the information is getting translated to a completely different language. Okay. And that's why it's called translation. So in my segment, I will be teaching you the DNA replication and transcription. Okay. In today's lecture and subsequent 2 lectures. Okay, and there are different enzymes. We're going to talk about these enzymes which conduct the DNA replication process. So DNA polymerase performs the DNA replication process, and the RNA polymerase performs the transcription process. Now you see in the previous slide here I have shown proteinase, RNase, DNase. Now I am saying polymerase. That means for any of the enzyme, if you want to remember the name, the last 3 letters should be A's for most of the cases. Okay, there are exceptions, always exceptions. But this is a common pattern. So when one particular enzyme can degrade the protein, we call them proteinase. When one particular enzyme can degrade the RNA, we call them RNase. If it degrades the DNA, we call them DNA. Similarly, when one particular protein or enzyme performs the DNA replication, what it does is basically it polymerizes the nucleotide. That's why polymerase. Okay, so DNA polymerase and then RNA polymerase. Okay, so we'll talk about these enzymes in greater detail. But before that, we'd like to know about the chemical structure of the nucleic acids. What is the chemical structure of the nucleic acid? Okay, so nucleic acids are the polymers and the monomers are basically nucleotides. So nucleic acids are the polymers of the nucleotides. I think all of you have learned about nucleotides and nucleic acids in your 12th standard. But just to revise or to brush up all those concepts. Okay, so nucleotides are the monomers, right? And what does the nucleotides are made up of? So nucleotides are made up of 3 different things, 3 major things. Okay, first of all, you have nitrogenous bases, and then you have the sugar, and these nitrogenous bases and the sugars together form the nucleosides, and nucleosides are connected through phosphates to form the nucleotides. Okay, let's see. Rather than remembering all these things, let's see how does they look like. Okay, so this is the sugar. Okay, ribose sugar. So this is a pentose. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this is a pentose sugar. Okay, and here the sugar is connected to the nitrogenous bases. It could be purine, it could be pyrimidine. Okay, and it is also through its 5' OH, it is connected through a phosphate moiety. Okay, so this is, if you have H in all of these positions, 1H, 2H, 3H, so that means H3PO4, right? So this is a phosphoric acid and this is a alcohol, CH2OH, right? So alcohol reacting with the acid leading to what? What gets generated when an alcohol reacts with acid?
Ester.
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 Yes. So that's why this is a ester bond, right? So you have a ester bond through which the phosphoric acid is attached to the alcohol, the 5' OH of the sugar. And then the one carbon atom, the 1' carbon atom through beta glycosidic bond is connected through the base, the pyrimidine and purine base. Okay. Now the basic difference between the RNA and DNA resides within the sugar. Okay. In case of the RNA, you have a OH at the 2' position. In case of the DNA, you have a H here. That's why in case of the DNA, it's deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, here deoxyribonucleic acid because you have a H, you are lacking a oxygen here. Whereas in case of the RNA, it's the ribonucleic acid. Okay, so these are the bases, the pyrimidine and the purines. Okay, and we have two different purines, adenines and guanines, and three different pyrimidines, cytidines, thymines, and uracils. Now, in case of the DNA, you have A, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Okay. In case of the RNA, you have adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. You won't be able to find a thymine in the RNA. Okay. And again, we never ask you to memorize these structures. We don't ask you to write down the structures of adenines or guanines. Don't worry. So you don't have to memorize all these things. Rather, just try to attend the class and then try to understand the concepts that I'm talking about. That should be good enough. Okay, you don't have to memorize all these complicated structures. Okay, so we have talked about the generic structure of the nucleic acids, nucleotides. These are the specific structures of the nucleotides. So this is DAMP or deoxyadenosine monophosphate, ribose, and then adenosine, deoxyribose, and then adenosine, and then the phosphate. Because there is one phosphate, that's why monophosphate. It could be triphosphate as well. So it's the triphosphates which actually act as a raw material. Okay. So deoxyadenosine monophosphate, deoxyguanosine monophosphate, deoxythymine thymidylate monophosphate, and deoxycytidylate or cytosine monophosphate. Okay. Similarly, for the RNA, you have the adenosine 5' monophosphate, guanosine 5' monophosphate, and so on. Uridine 5' monophosphate and cytidine 5' monophosphate. In case of the DNA, you have the T. In case of the RNA, you have the U. Okay. Now, how does the DNA look like? Okay, DNA or RNA look like the chains, the polymers of the nucleic acids. As I was saying, the nucleic acids are basically polymers of nucleotides. Okay, so individual units are the nucleotides. The polymers are basically the nucleic acids. So you see what we have mentioned. Each of the nucleotides should have a sugar. So you have a sugar. Okay, and the 5' OH is connected to a phosphate. Here is the phosphate, and the 1' carbon is connected to a base, nitrogenous base. Here it's A. Now, here is the 3' OH which is connected to the phosphate. Now, again the 3' OH is also connected to the phosphate of the preceding nucleotide. Okay, so here is another unit, monomeric unit, another nucleotide again another sugar, another base, and another phosphate. So here it is connected to the 5' CH2OH, and it is with the preceding nucleotide, it is connected to 3'. So that's why there is a 3' to 5' phosphodiester linkage. Why diester? Because this is the acid H3PO4 which is connected to two different OH. Okay, here is the OH, this is another OH. So that's why it's a diester, not a monoester. This is a diester. Here is a ester bond. Okay. So here is a ester bond and here is another ester bond. Okay. So that's why diester. So as you can see, individual nucleotides. So this is one particular unit. This is another unit. And this is another unit. So individual nucleotides, monomeric units, are connected to each other through phosphodiester linkages. Okay. And if you think about the backbone of this particular polymer, what do you have? You have the phosphate and then sugar. Again phosphate, sugar, phosphate and sugar, right? That creates the backbone of the DNA. Whereas the bases, these bases are expanded sidewise or projected sidewise. So the basic backbone of the DNA is basically sugars and phosphates, whereas the bases are projected sidewise. Okay, and same is true for the RNA. You have nucleotide, one particular ribonucleic acid, another ribonucleotide, another ribonucleotide, and they are connected through the 3' to 5' phosphodiester linkage, and so on. Okay, again the same phosphate sugar backbone or sugar phosphate backbone, and the side chains are projected sidewise. Okay. Now, one very important thing you should notice here, that you see whether any nucleic acid, whether it's a DNA or it's a RNA, you have a 5' end and a 3' end. Okay, this is extremely important because if you think about a script, when you think about a language, one particular script, right? Because it retains information, that's why any script should have a directionality, right? For our regular scripts, we write from left to right, right? And that directionality should be maintained. If you just reverse the script, you will not be able to find any meaning out of it. That's why for any script, the directionality is extremely important. Similarly, for the DNA, because it's a script which retains the genetic information, okay, that's why the nucleic acid, the DNA or the RNA should also have a directionality. And what is the directionality? What defines its directionality? This is the 5' to 3'. So 5' end should always have a free phosphate, and the 3' end should always have a 3' OH. You remember this very carefully. Okay. So any nucleic acid should have a directionality. It should be growing. Whenever we will be discussing about DNA replication, we'll be seeing that the DNA always gets synthesized from 5' to 3' direction. Okay. So initially this is there, then another nucleotide comes in and forms this phosphodiester bond. Another nucleotide comes in, forms this phosphodiester bond, and the last nucleotide should have the free 3' OH, and the first nucleotide should have a free 3' phosphate, and this 5' to 3', 5' phosphate and 3' OH gives the nucleic acid its directionality. Okay, so if I am writing, say for example, A and G, C, T, T. Say for example, this is a DNA sequence. Even if I'm not writing, if I'm not mentioning, you should consider that this is 5' end and this is 3' end, because I have written it in that way, from left to right, 5' to 3'. Okay, this is very important. All right, now as I was saying that RNA is a less stable material, DNA is the most stable entity, whereas RNA is extremely unstable. Why RNA is unstable? Okay, so RNA is unstable because of this particular OH, this particular 2' OH, which is absent in the DNA. Why is it so? See, this is the 2' OH which is present in the RNA but absent in the DNA. Now, if you have a little bit of alkaline pH where you have OH minus in the medium, it can quickly scavenge this particular proton, and that will lead to a nucleophilic attack to this particular phosphate moiety, leading to a formation of a cyclic phosphodiester bond. So this is cyclic phosphodiester, okay, and that will lead to the cleavage of the phosphodiester linkage, which is the main linkage between the individual nucleotides. As a result of that, if you have a very minute amount of OH minus ion in the solution, that can cleave off the RNA very easily. So the RNA will get degraded. So even at a very mild basic pH, the RNA could easily be degraded spontaneously. Okay, so that's why RNA is less stable than the DNA. And this is why the nature has evolved in such a way. So there is one particular theory of RNA world. Okay, and as per that theory, RNA evolve first as the biological molecule which can retain both the information, the genetic information, and at the same time it can also have enzymatic activity. Okay, so we'll be talking about that in one of the later slides. Okay, now so as per the RNA world theory, RNA is the first biological molecule that appeared on the earth, because it has the ability of both storing the information as well as the enzymatic activity. But later on, nature has evolved in such a way that it has replaced RNA with the DNA, so that because DNA is more stable. Okay, and this is why nature has evolved in such a way that it can utilize DNA as the storage material.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, does that theory also tell about how the DNA came on Earth? Like, I know it's not a good question, but I wonder how, from where can the RNA come on itself? Like, does that theory also tell about itself, or just it assumes that it was there?
So basically the theory of evolution is basically very complicated. Okay, so there are different theories which suggest about the appearance, but it's not that it's always justified. There are different hypotheses based upon different evidences which are present, but it's not foolproof. So if you ask that where did the RNA came from, it's not possible to talk about that. Maybe we can look into books which can have justifications, but what the basic principle of the RNA world is basically that, because so when we'll be talking about ribosomes, so there the main enzymatic activity is performed by the RNA. Okay, so from there it has been proposed that because RNA can have both the property of protein, because most of the enzymes are proteins. I think all of you know that most of the enzymes are proteins, but there are certain enzymatic activities which is performed by the RNA. So in the simplest form of life, if we have a molecule which can both store the genetic information, at the same time can also have the enzymatic activities, then it might lead to the formation of a very simple form of life. Okay, so just one simple molecule which can perform both of the function which is essential for the establishment of the life on the earth. That's why that theory came up, that it might be the RNA which evolved first on the earth. And not only that, associated with the RNA theory, the virus first hypothesis also came in, that because viruses have the RNA, can retain their genetic information in the RNA. So it might be the RNA that came in, and then subsequently it established viruses as a simplest form of life, which retains RNA as their genetic information. But anyway, if we keep on discussing about the theory of evolution, we can spend hours and hours after that, because these are extremely interesting theories. But again, as I was saying, that RNA might be the first molecule that evolved on the earth, appeared on the earth, and subsequently nature have evolved so that it can replace the RNA with the DNA. Okay, but that doesn't mean that RNA is not essential. That doesn't mean the central dogma of life. In the central dogma of life, it is possible that DNA can directly be translated into proteins. You need to have these unstable molecules act as a bridge between DNA and the protein. Okay, and why is it so? Why nature has designed its principle in such a way that protein is more stable, the DNA, I think, the most stable entity, then it's the protein, and the least stable entity is the RNA. But then it has kept the RNA as the bridge between DNA and the protein. Why Mother Nature has devised the principle in such a way? Because if protein could directly be translated from the DNA, once you have the DNA, you will always keep on synthesizing proteins. But in our system, we need specific proteins to be synthesized in specific times. Okay, so it's not that all the times are needed all the time. Okay, for example, for humans, there are certain hormones during the growth phase. Certain hormones are needed to be secreted at the later phase of the life, in the adulthood, right? If those hormones get secreted from the very beginning, it will mess up the entire life cycle of a particular organism. So that's why the protein synthesis has to be regulated. And that's why the RNA is there. That means whenever it's necessary to synthesize the protein, the DNA will synthesize the RNA, and then RNA will lead to the synthesis of the proteins. And once that is done, RNA synthesis will be stopped. And because RNA is an unstable material, it can quickly be degraded, so that the protein synthesis will automatically be stopped. But if it is direct translation from DNA to protein, it will be a constant process of protein synthesis. So see, such a nice system, such an intelligent system, that you have the two very stable molecules, and in between you have introduced a less stable molecule purposefully, so that you can regulate the process. Okay, so these are the kind of concepts which is present in the biological system, which could very be useful in order to utilize in your respective subjects. And the whole purpose of this particular course is to make you accustomed that these kind of phenomena exist in the living system. Okay, all right. So we are talking about the DNA, and if you look into the structure of the DNA, this is how it look like. So in case of the RNA, so in case of the DNA, you always have double-stranded structure. So two strands of the DNA base pair with each other to form a double-stranded DNA. But in case of the RNA, it's a single-stranded molecule. So how does double-stranded DNA forms? Let's look into that. So this is a strand of the DNA. Okay. So these circles represent the phosphodiester linkage. Okay. So this is phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, and so on. So this is the backbone. And as I was saying, the bases are projected sidewise. So these are the bases. Okay. And another strand. Okay. So again, you have sugar, phosphate, and so on. And you see the bases which are projecting sidewise, now they can participate in some kind of bonding. What are these bonding? These are nothing but hydrogen bonding. So you see, adenine can form hydrogen bonding with thymine. So there are two particular hydrogen bonds here. Okay, and this base pairing is about 11.1 Armstrong. The length of this base pairing is 11.1 Armstrong. Whereas in guanine always form hydrogen bonds with cytosine. Okay, and there are three distinct hydrogen bonds. Okay, and the length of the base pairing is 10.8 Armstrong. So if I ask you that which particular base pairing is more stronger, is it the GC or is it the AT?
GC.
GC.
Yeah, definitely. So because it has three different hydrogen bonds, and that's why it is also evident from the bond distance as well, 10.8 Armstrong, which is lesser than 11.1 Armstrong. Okay, so and that is why A always will form hydrogen bonding with the thymine. A always base pair with T. G will always base pair with C. Okay, and in that way they will form a hydrogen bonding. Also, if the directionality of one strand of the DNA is from 5 prime to 3 prime, the other should be oriented in the reverse direction, 5 prime to 3 prime. Okay, and you will be discussing why is it so during our replication, during our discussion of DNA replication. Okay, but for the time being, you just remember that the DNA, the two strands of the DNA is always inverse in terms of their reverse, in terms of their directionality, and should be complementary to each other. Why complementary? Because if one strand has the C, the other strand should have the G over there. So if I write in a way that if I give you the sequence of one particular strand A, T, C, T, T, G, and this is 5 prime to 3 prime. What is the sequence of the other strand? In that case, you have to write C, T, C, A, right? A, G, A, T, and this is 5 prime to 3 prime. Okay, so they are reverse as well as complementary to each other. Two DNA strands should be reverse as well as complementary to each other. Okay, clear? Okay, another representation of the double-stranded DNA structure. So you have the phosphate sugar backbone, which is running from 5 prime to 3 prime direction, and you have the base pairs, the bases projecting sidewise, and you have the complementary strand where it is running in the 5 prime to 3 prime direction, and again the bases are complementary to each other. Great. Okay. Now, whatever I have discussed, it's mentioned here. Chargaff's rule says that the A always should base pair with T, G should always base pair with C. Hence, the two strands should be complementary. Directionality of the two DNA strands should be opposite to each other. You can also say that they are anti-parallel. Okay. Now, DNA structure. So, I think all of you know Watson and Crick, two different scientists together, won the Nobel Prize in 1962 for their discovery of the structure of the DNA. So what they did is they have crystallized the DNA and subsequently have performed X-ray crystallography, and this is the X-ray crystallography image of the DNA, and based upon that they have proposed this double helical model of DNA. And how does it look like? This is how it looks like. So this is a double helical structure. Okay, and you have, if you look into one particular turn, so this is one complete turn which spans about 36 Armstrong, and the wide, and this is about 20 Armstrong wide. Okay, and you have the distance between the individual base pairs is about 3.4 Armstrongs. So about 9 or 10 to 11 base pairs for each turn. Okay, this is the three-dimensional representation of 3D representation of the DNA structure. Okay, now if you look into this particular structure, what you will be able to see that there is a groove kind of structure. So here is a groove kind of structure, right? Here is a groove kind of structure, right? Or hole kind of structure. And these are bigger grooves. You should also able to find a smaller grooves here, 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 right? So there are bigger grooves and there are smaller grooves. The bigger grooves corresponds to this particular turn, okay, and that is known as major groove, and this particular turn corresponds to the smaller groove, or also known as minor grooves. Okay, so this is how the DNA structure looks like. Okay, now if you take double-stranded DNA, okay, and if you want to separate the two DNA strands from each other, how can you separate that? Is it possible to separate the two strands of DNA from each other? Anybody wants to answer?
By breaking the bonds,
How can you break the bonds?
enzymes.
Definitely, there are enzymes. Excellent. So we are going to talk about that particular
So
enzyme in the next class. But
we can break the hydrogen bonds by heating.
yes, perfect. So both are right answers, right? You can break the hydrogen bonds by heating, because these are hydrogen bonds, not covalent bonds. Covalent bonds is difficult to break by heating, but hydrogen bonds should be easy to break by heating. So you can heat. So in one particular solution, you take up the DNA and then you heat up the DNA. Okay, you can keep on increasing the temperature. Okay, and at one particular temperature, you will be able to see that the DNA, the two strands of the DNA got completely separated from each other. Okay, so now if you take DNA and perform a spectral measurement, you put the solution in a UV visible spectrophotometer and then shade light at 260 nanometer. You should be able to see a peak because DNA absorbs at 260 nanometer. And then you keep on hitting, the two strands will be getting separated from each other and you will be seeing a peak shift. I'm not going to get into that. But in that way, by increasing the temperature, you should be able to monitor the denaturation of the temperature, denaturation of the DNA. And you keep on increasing the temperature, you should be able to break more and more hydrogen bonds, and you should be able to separate the two DNA strands from each other. Okay, now at one particular point, 50% of the DNA molecules should be separated from each other, and we call that particular temperature as a melting temperature for the DNA. Okay, so here you have taken one particular DNA, two particular solutions of the DNA. One is represented with the blue line and the other is represented with the red line. And you started heating them and you are monitoring the denaturation. Okay. And and at one particular point, you should be able to see that 50% of the molecule got denatured. Okay. So that particular temperature is known as melting temperature. Now, I give you a question that is it possible to predict about the chemical nature of these two DNA samples by looking into their melting curve? This is the melting curve of the DNA. So by looking into the melting curve, is it possible to predict anything about the chemical nature of these two DNAs?
Sir, the red curve has more number of GC bonds because the TM is higher there, and higher temperature will be required to break the hydrogen bonds in that case because they are stronger, because there are 3 bonds.
Excellent.
Completely right. Perfect answer. So basically the red one contains DNA which contains higher number of GCs. And as I have shown you that GC base pairing contains 3 different hydrogen bonding, and that's why so if one particular DNA contains higher percentage of GC base pairing, it will need higher temperature to break those hydrogen bonds. Okay, that means their melting temperature will be higher. So just by looking into the melting temperature, you should be able to predict about the percentage, the overall percentage. You will not be able to say that what is the percentage, but you will be able to say a relative, you will be able to predict a relative percentage of the base pairs, different kinds of base pairs. Excellent, we are going great. Now I think we know enough, we have enough background to get into the DNA replication process. Okay, now that we know about the structure of the DNA, how the DNA looks like, what are it's made up of, I think now we should move into the particular concept of DNA replication, that how does the DNA replication occurs. Okay, so DNA replication is one of the most fundamental event for the maintenance, growth, production of progeny for any living organisms. Okay, so this is one of the most fundamental concept or most fundamental process for the life to occur. But how does it happen? You have, so I think in case of the human chromosome, the total number of DNA, I think it's about 10 to the power 9. Am I true? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's in billions of base pairs. That means we have different chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromosomes, and altogether there is about billions of bases which are connected to each other. Now, in order to replicate those DNAs, you have to synthesize exact replica of those DNAs, right? So it has to be highly precise. If you incorporate wrong bases during the DNA replication process, that means you are introducing mutations, and these introduction of these kind of mutations can lead to the change of the genetic information, can mess up with the genetic information, which leads to genetic disease. So when we talk about genetic disease, those are basically happens due to misincorporation of the nucleotides in your chromosome that may alter the structure of certain proteins, because DNA has the information to synthesize the protein. If you mess up with the information, altered protein will be synthesized, they will be malfunctioning, your entire system will be malfunctioning, you will be having genetic disorders leading to genetic disease, right? So that's why it has to be extremely precise. Okay, it has to happen with extreme perfection. How does it happen? So DNA replication, that's why DNA replication always have to happen in a template dependent way. Okay, if there is a A in the template, there should be an incorporation of T in the nascent DNA which is getting synthesized. If there is a G, there has to incorporation of a C in the nascent DNA template, right? So that's why DNA replication should always happen in a template dependent manner. Otherwise, you will be incorporating random nucleotides. That means you will not be able to create an exact replica of the template DNA. So this is the first principle of DNA replication. That is, DNA replication always has to happen in a template dependent manner. The enzyme DNA polymerase can read the DNA template and can incorporate complementary nucleotides in the nascent DNA strand that can base pair with the template. Okay, so the enzyme will be reading the DNA template and subsequently will bring in the complementary nucleotide. That complementary nucleotide first will base pair with the template, and then only it will be incorporated into the nascent DNA strand. If there is a mismatch, that means if there is a and you bring in the enzyme brought in a T, if there is a and the enzyme brought in a G, there will be no base pairing, it will not be incorporated. Okay, so that's why the polymerase, the DNA polymerase, is also known as DNA dependent DNA polymerase. Why? Because okay, so yeah, so that's why the DNA has the DNA polymerase is also known as DNA dependent DNA polymerase, right? Because it has to read the template and has to incorporate the complementary bases in the nascent DNA strand. A guanine, there is a G in the template, should lead to the incorporation of the cytosine and so on. Okay, the newly synthesized DNA strand should be, and that's why the newly synthesized DNA strand should always be complementary to the parent DNA strand, right? So now I think you have an idea that why the two strands of a double-stranded DNA is always complementary to each other, right? Because they are getting synthesized, they always get synthesized in that particular fashion. Okay, so now let's get back to earlier days when people haven't figured out the model of DNA replication. Okay, so just after when did Watson and Crick got their Nobel Prize? I think it's 1960. They have discovered the structure in 1953 or something like that. And just after people came to know about the structure of the DNA, people started developing models in order to describe the process of DNA replication. So at that particular time, scientists have proposed 3 different models. Out of those 3 different models, I'm showing you 2 different models here. So we are going to talk about 2 different models. And these are completely based upon hypothesis. Okay, that how does the DNA replication takes place? One is the semi-conservative model and the other is conservative model. Okay, so in the semi-conservative model, what Watson and Crick has proposed that so say for example, this is the parental DNA strand, and during the DNA replication process, what happens is it gets separated, the individual strands get separated into 2 individual strands, and subsequently new strands get separated while reading the parental strand, so that after replication it will generate 2 double-stranded DNA. One parental DNA will generate 2 daughter double-stranded DNA, where half of the identity of the double-stranded DNA will remain conserved. That means half of the strand, that is one of the strand, will be coming from the parent and one strand will be newly synthesized. That's why identity of the strand of the double-stranded DNA remains conserved in a half, right? That's why this particular model is known as semi-conservative model. Whereas in other groups, what they have proposed, that the parental DNA definitely will lead to the synthesis of two daughter DNA, where the parental DNA will retain its complete identity, whereas the daughter strand will be synthesized completely new. Okay, so here the parental strand is conserving its identity completely. That's why this is conservative model. Whereas in the semi-conservative model, the parental strand is retaining half of its identity in the daughter strand. So that is why this is semi-conservative model. Okay, so this model has been proposed by Watson and Crick, and later on, so what they have proposed that the parental DNA gets separated from each other, and then each of those strands act as a template for the synthesis of the new strands. Okay, so that half, so one strand in the daughter double-stranded DNA, in the two double-stranded DNA, one strand will be coming from the parent and one will be newly synthesized. Okay, and actually later on it has been proven by a very unique experiment that is the semi-conservative model of the DNA which is followed in all living organism. Whenever there is a living organism, it has to undergo DNA replication process, and not only that, it has to undergo DNA replication process following the semi-conservative model. Okay, so Messelson and Stolz actually in 1958. So Watson and Crick has discovered the structure of the DNA, I think 1953, and later on they have proposed this semi-conservative model, but they were not having any direct evidence that this is the model that is followed by the nature. But then Messelson and Stoll has performed one particular experiment in 1958, which proved that the nature follows the semi-conservative model for its replication of the DNA. Okay, so I would stop here, and we in the next class will initiate from the Messelson-Stolz experiment. Okay, because this is a very important experiment, very nice experiment. So Messelson-Stolz experiment actually has been recognized as one of the most beautiful experiment in the science. Okay, so that's why I want to take a good bit of amount of time in order to describe this particular experiment. Okay, but you will see that how simple this particular experiment is, and in spite of that, it has solved one of the most complicated problem of the nature. That is, whether in which particular uh, way the DNA replication takes place. Okay. So in the next class, we'll be talking about we'll be starting from the Messelson-Stolz experiment. Okay. So again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to send me their questions through email.